This is my stealth shed. It's basically a tiny folding flat pack cabin complete with wheels, extendable handles, a skylight and even a wood stove for winter camping. I can set it up pretty much anywhere in a matter of minutes, and I can pack it away in the back of my car. This is the first prototype, and I intend to learn from the mistakes that I made in this version and create an even better version soon. The majority of the stealth shed is built with OSB. I chose OSB because it was cheap and on offer at the time. However, in hindsight, it's not good when exposed to the elements. But I deal with this later down the line. I built the base frame using treated 95mm by 35mm lumber, which is roughly 3.4 by 1.7 inches for those of you that prefer imperial measurements. I put the box frame together with some large screws. To make the floor more rigid, I cut out 4 joists from the same lumber and secured these to the frame. I then secured a sheet of 11mm OSB to the top. As I would be using this shed in the woods throughout the year, I needed to make sure that it would be raised off the ground. This is especially important during the winter months, where the woodland stays wet the majority of the time. I had some old offcuts of some fence posts in the back garden, so I thought these would make great folding legs, as they are treated and designed to be outside for long periods of time. I did a dry run first to check that they would pivot okay and fold down flush underneath the base of the cabin. I then made a 10mm hole through the frame and the fence post and attached the leg to the frame with a large coach bolt. The leg could now move freely and it folded down easily. But by building the legs this way, it does mean that all of the weight of the cabin is going to be on these bolts. But having now used the cabin for over 6 months, they are holding up just fine. I do need to look at upgrading these to something better down the line. I flipped the base over and checked that the legs were even and secure. With the foundation complete, I then worked on building the sides. I cut the OSB to match the length of the cabin, and then made the height pretty much the same width as the base. This is so that when it folds down, it will fold down flat within the parameters of the base. I decided to use some 75mm butt hinges to secure the sides to the base. I marked out the holes and secured them with some screws. I used larger screws than the ones provided, as the base was over 95mm thick. However, to secure the sidewalls of the hinges, I was limited to the 11mm thickness of the OSB, so I had to use smaller screws for this part. Later on, I found out it would be easier to use small bolts for this side of the hinge. Another thing that I was soon to discover was because of the nature of OSB and the way that it's made, the pressure from the screws would wear loose in the holes, as the OSB does not have much structural integrity compared to something like hardwood ply. So now I had a solid base and one folding side. The next part was relatively tricky, as I needed to raise the hinges up at least 11mm so that this side would fold down flat on top of the OSB on the other side. I did this by securing a piece of wood to the outside of the frame with some large screws, and then I attached the hinges to the top of this. With the folding sides complete, I cut up a number of small pieces of 25 by 38mm wood, which were about 10 centimeters long. I drilled holes in each ends of the wood and attached these to the outside frame of the cabin floor. I left a gap in each one that was roughly the same width as the pieces of wood. I tested this out by moving the pieces of wood in between the uprights. If it was too tight, then the chances are that when it rains, the wood would expand and the sides of the cabin won't slot into place. I finished it off by putting in a horizontal piece of wood for the side supports to slot into. The weather forecast then took a turn for the worst, so I had to continue the project indoors. I decided that I wanted the cabin to have a pitched roof, and so I found the middle point in each side piece and marked out an apex for the roof. I then laid each side piece flat against the base and marked out the area where the vertical supports were going to go. Then I made sure the vertical uprights were level and secured this in with 4 screws. I did a test fit and it seemed to work well, so I did the same to the other side. Now I had all 4 sides of the cabin built, I needed to find a way to secure them together. So I opted to use a small wire hasp and staple. They are really cheap and a simple solution to stop the sides from falling over. I fitted these to all 4 corners of the cabin. With the sides finished, it was onto the roof. I marked out a small rectangle the same diameter as the 28 by 38mm lumber. Using a jigsaw, I cut out the rectangle so that the lumber could slot in there. The first cut was to be for the ridgepole. I cut 2 more slots on each side of the apex, which would add more support for the roof and prevent it from sagging too much if it gets wet. I grabbed some more butt hinges and secured these to the ridge. The next part was arguably the hardest part of the whole project, mainly because I opted to try and make an entire roof side from an acrylic sheet. I marked out where the hinges would go and then made some holes in the acrylic. If you haven't worked with acrylic before, consider yourself fortunate. It's pretty horrible to work with and often cracks or snaps quite easily. To start with, I made the holes with an awl because I was worried about cracking it. This seemed to work well, but even here you can still see it made a small crack. I lightly sanded any raised areas so that the hinges would sit flush. To cut the acrylic to size, I used a jigsaw with a fine-tooth metal blade. I sprayed the blade with some WD-40, as sometimes the blade gets hot and it can melt the acrylic. When it does this, it can jam up and make a mess of the cut. Anyway, this seemed to work okay, and I managed to keep the damage to the acrylic to a minimum. Before I secured the acrylic to the hinges, I peeled back the protective cover, and then I used some small nuts and bolts to attach the acrylic to the hinges on the ridge. Because I could only buy the acrylic sheets in one size, I had to cut an extra length to cover the final portion of the roof. This was annoying, but I actually changed the roof later in the video. With all the hinges attached, I used the socket and ratchet to tighten the bolts. I was wary that acrylic can crack really easily if you screw or bolt it too tight, so I did it tight enough that the hinges wouldn't slip. For the other side of the roof, I wanted it to be solid, so I used another piece of OSB, but this time I went for 9mm to save on weight. As I wouldn't be walking or putting weight on the roof, I could get away with using thinner material. I cut this to length and secured it to the ridge by using more butt hinges. The reason I was using hinges on the roof was so that once I picked it up and off the cabin, it would pack down flat, which was the whole point of this experiment. After another brief visit from the site inspector, I cracked on with getting the roof finished. With the skylight complete, it was onto the door and window. I used a paint pot to create the circle portion for the porthole window. Then I measured out a rough outline for the door, trying to make it as wide as possible, but naturally I was restricted with how much area I could work, given the cabin was tiny. I used a 10mm drill bit to drill a pilot hole for the jigsaw blade to fit in, and then I cut out the circle for the porthole window. I then marked out the hinges for the door and cut this out. In hindsight, I wouldn't have put the hinges at the base of the door. I would have put them on the side and have it open like a normal door. But for some reason, I ended up doing it this way. Trying my best not to waste any material, I cut out a thin strip of OSB from the discarded window. I cut this strip up into small pieces and drilled a hole into each of them. I then secured these to the top of the door so that they could act as latches to stop the door from falling out. Using a pen, a screw, and some string, I cut out a circle from an offcut of the acrylic. I then cut this circle out, peeled off the protective layer, and secured this to the inside of the cabin door with some sealant. It doesn't look pretty from the inside, but from the outside it looks like a glass porthole, which was the look I was going for. To finish it off, I needed to attach a handle to the inside and outside of the door. I went for these T-bar handles, as they were on offer and I'm pretty tight. I just used the cardboard that they were attached to as a template, marked out the holes, and attached them with the bolts that were supplied with them. I attached a second handle on the inside, but this time below the port window. As I was going to be heating this cabin with a tiny wood stove, I decided to make a little bit of extra airflow. So I marked out an area for the 200 by 150mm grill and cut this section of the wall out. I used a piece of cardboard as a template to make sure that the area I was cutting was not too large that the vent would fall through. With the hole cut, I secured the vent in place with 4 screws. Now I had a way of adjusting the airflow inside the cabin if it gets too hot. The final stage was to install the stove jack. I decided to use a square of highly flame retardant glass fibre material, which is heat resistant up to 300 degrees Celsius. I marked around the edge and left enough room for the Velcro border to be secured to the roof. Then I cut this square out with the jigsaw. I had a roll of Velcro in a drawer in the workshop which had sticky 3M backing to it. However, I did a test piece on the OSB to see if it would stick, and it confirmed my suspicions and pulled off really easily. So I decided to keep the backing on and actually secure this down with some no-nails. That way I can still pull off the backing and use the Velcro again if I need to. With the Velcro border secure, now I could attach the stove jack material. I used a knife and cut an X into the material. That way I could use different diameter stovepipes if I ever had to use this material on a different tent or shelter. I ended up buying 2 pieces of the stove jack material. That way, if there is rain in the forecast and I'm not using the wood stove, I could just stick on the other square on top, and it is sealed from the rain. The final addition to the cabin was to make some sort of heat-resistant backing to the wood stove area. I still had some offcuts of 2mm aluminium tread plate that I'd used in my bunker series a few years ago. There's a link to that in the description below. I cut this up and drilled some holes into it. I then secured this to the inside far corner of the cabin, as this was the area that the wood stove would sit in, and so the area that needs the most protection. As for the base of the stove, I have something else for that, which you will see later in the video. And now my cabin was ready for its maiden voyage into the woods. I lashed the cabin to a wheelbarrow using some cam straps. Whilst this worked fine in transporting the cabin up into the woods, I realised the cabin was definitely going to need some wheels of its own. I found a nice location for the cabin and began to construct it. I was pleased with how quick and easy it all went together. The gable end pieces slotted in easily, and I used these small wooden pegs to secure the hasps together and keep the sides from falling out. The acrylic skylight roof went on okay, but I could see it was already beginning to crack. I definitely needed to find a solution to this. The door opened fine, but it was quite restrictive with the way that it opened, so I knew I needed to change that. A week or so later, I decided to implement these changes. Firstly, I painted the entire outside of the cabin with black bitumen paint. This stuff is really horrible to paint on, but when it dries, it completely seals the OSB and protects it from the elements. After a few consecutive days of rain, it was great to see beads of water running off it. I went back to the drawing board with the skylight and cut a frame out of the OSB, but this time I made sure that there was a solid frame around the outside of the OSB to make the window more secure. I had some more acrylic left over, so I cut this to shape, drilled some holes in it, and secured it to the OSB with some screws. I then put some sealant around the edge of the acrylic to prevent the water from getting underneath and inside the cabin. I added a coat of bitumen paint, and now when I opened the window, it was much more sturdy as the frame was secured via the OSB and not directly to the acrylic. The final touch for the roof was to cap it off. For this, I used a piece of half drain pipe and used the awl to punch some holes in each of the ends. I then placed the cap so that it covered the ridge of the cabin where the roof apex meets. I screwed in a small cup hook in each of the ends of the ridge. And lashed the drain pipe to these with some strong bank line. For the door, I decided to put the hinges on the side so that it opens more like a traditional door would and not like a chicken coop. I now needed to focus on the interior of the cabin, so I bought a 2-metre length of USB LED strip light and attached this to the ridge of the cabin using some cable clips. In keeping with the folding properties of the cabin, I decided that this small folding wood stove would be best. As a temporary solution, I made a small wood stand from OSB to prevent my sleeping bag from touching the wood stove. The stovepipe on this particular stove is a roll-out one, but I was pleased that when it was put together, it fit inside the stove jack no problem. Now it was time to do the first overnight in the folding cabin. I lit the stove and the cabin warmed up within minutes.
There is smoke.
Within the first hour of lighting the wood stove, there was a strong smell inside the cabin, which was due to the off-gassing of the glue that was used to stick the chunks of wood together for the OSB sheets of wood. I could easily vent the cabin by just lifting up the skylight and propping it open with some firewood. It acted as one big air vent, and after 15 or 20 minutes the smell had gone. After cooking up some military MRE food on the stove, I needed to get the cabin ready for nightfall. I have these two paraffin lanterns which can easily burn for the whole night. I hooked one on the cup hook at the back of the cabin that was used to secure the drain pipe to the ridge, and the other one I hanged near the entrance to the front door. As dusk approached, there was a really moody backdrop of the silhouettes of the trees through the skylight. It looked awesome, and now that it was beginning to get dark, I could test out the LED lighting. I was pleasantly surprised with how bright the LEDs were, and I was powering this off a small portable power bank the size of a mobile phone. I was able to change the colour of the lights, or just put them on auto and let them change colour themselves. I got my sleeping bag and mattress out and settled down for the night. The next day, I cooked up some breakfast on the stove and packed away the cabin, as I wouldn't be coming back to it for a few months. 3 months later, I decided I could still make some improvements to this cabin before I called it finished as the first prototype. The first change I made was to paint the interior of the cabin. This way, the paint reduces the off-gassing of the OSB when it gets hot inside. It will also make the OSB last a lot longer. I used a small roller to apply the paint and once I painted the gable ends, I also painted the sides, the inside of the roof, and the base of the cabin too. Given that the cabin is so small, I decided that I needed to maximise the space as best as I could. So I found these cheap elastic storage webbing pockets, which come in different sizes. They secure to the wall with these sticky back tie-up points, and these can also be secured with a small screw. The webbing has elastic loops on the end of each corner, which wrap around the tie-up points to keep the storage bag taut. I installed the largest storage webbing on one of the inside walls of the cabin. The other two smaller ones I installed on the opposite side. This now gives me plenty of extra storage for clothes, cooking items and food that I would have otherwise not been able to put on the walls. It also means that these can flat pack with the cabin itself and not take up any extra room or put any stress on the hinges. I then used some more offcuts of wood to create a slot in the wall on one of the gable ends. That way I had more of a fixed barrier between the sleeping bag and the wood stove. It also meant that I could have a raised platform for the wood stove and space underneath it for firewood. I soon decided that the blue interior paint on the cabin felt cold and didn't seem to fit in well with the surrounding woodland. So I used a can of green spray paint and sprayed a layer of sage green over the blue. This not only gives the wood an added layer of protection, but it is also far more aesthetic and pleasing to the eye than the blue was. I sprayed over all sections of the inside of the walls and even the inside of the roof, so that the entire interior of the cabin was sage green. Having pushed the cabin along on the wheelbarrow, it was hard work, and I needed the wheelbarrow for other things. So I bought a pair of large wheelbarrow wheels with a deep tread on them. These ones came in bright red, which didn't look right, so I taped up around the edges of where the plastic wheel meets the rubber tyre, and then sprayed these green too. And because I had sprayed everything green, I had to take off all of the storage compartments and then reinstall them once the paint had dried. I took off both folding legs on one side of the cabin and drilled a hole for these large 200mm M12 coach bolts. I secured the wheels to the frame with these bolts and the spacers that came with the wheelbarrow wheels. Looking back now, it would have been much better to get long threaded bar and use it as a through axle for the wheels. That way there would be much less pressure on the joints where the wheels are attached to the base of the cabin, and it would also mean they would wobble far less. Anyway, I went ahead and shortened the legs on the opposite side as they now needed to match the height of the wheels so that the cabin would sit flat. And now it was time to install some handles. For this, I cut two long pieces of wood that were about 2 feet longer than the cabin itself. I thinned out one end of the handles for better grip, and then I screwed 2 pieces of wood either side of the handles to pinch them in place, but not too tight that the handles couldn't slide. I did the same further down the other end of the handles and added in a stopper block so that the handles couldn't slide all the way through the arches and fall out. Now it was the moment of truth. I flipped the cabin over and pumped some air into the tyres. I checked that the handles could slide out freely, and then I took my cabin for a walk. I was really pleased with how it worked. The cabin was much easier to move around than it was when it was on the wheelbarrow. Although the wheels did wobble, they still felt pretty secure. For the final touch of the cabin, I wanted to install this porthole window. It's actually made for a boat, but I thought it would make a great replacement for the acrylic one, which I had made a few months earlier, which sadly just fell off after a few weeks of being outdoors. I put some silicone sealant around the edge of the window, and the same to the gasket the other side. Then I bolted this to the gable end to secure it in place and added some more sealant to the outer rim. And there we have it, my folding stealth shed cabin, or at least prototype number 1 of my folding cabin. There are a number of things I would change, not least of which is to build it with much lighter materials. I'm going to be making some plans for the second prototype of this cabin so that it will be much more efficient. I would love to know what you guys think of it and any changes that you would make. Thanks for watching my video, I really appreciate it. And if you enjoyed it, there are many more like this on my channel, including a series on where I build a large bushcraft Viking house with a bark roof, a thatched roof Anglo-Saxon house, a Celtic roundhouse, and even a small cabin made entirely from recycled pallets. I'll put links to these in the description box below. Cheers for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.